Thank you so much for that. And thank you for having me here. And to all the organizers, it's really a pleasure. I don't live very far away. I'm over in Boulder, but it's great to be here. And actually, I was thinking in my 25 years living here, thank you. I'm not sure I've actually ever been to Evergreen. So I know. Um, so after hearing the other three authors today, I have to say, lower your expectations. I mean, I was so inspired by all of their stories and their command of language and their passion. And I've always actually, ever since I started writing, I've always been fascinated by other writers because it's such a weird thing to do and to want to do that was actually the inspiration for starting this Making It Up show that I have. And I started that earlier this year, and it's a pretty simple premise. I just sit down with other writers from all different backgrounds. They could be fiction, nonfiction, science writers, and I just talk to them like, what's your deal? Why are you doing what you're doing? And at the end of every episode, we just pick a random book from my bookshelves, and I have them pick a random sentence, and that's the first sentence of a short story that we craft together on the fly, which is nerve-wracking every time. But I'm always curious about origin stories for writers, and after talking to several dozen writers already for this show, you start to see themes, right? Like I was always in the library as a kid, or my family moved around a lot, so books were my best friends. Or a lot of times it's there were writers in my family, so I became a lit major, and boy, that wasn't my experience at all. As Lynn said, I went to hotel school, and I worked in hotels in high school, and I went to Cornell Hotel School, and I thought I was going to be in operations or maybe in development or consulting, and this is painful to say, I don't think I read a single work of fiction while in my 4 years of college. I just was not much of a reader, and I didn't have to take any English courses, so I didn't. Um, I graduated and I worked in hotel operations for a few years, which is where I learned to loathe the general public, and so I quickly got out of that. And I did go into consulting for the hospitality industry. And it was just a kind of a straight line. You're a business guy now, and this is what you do, and a lot of real estate finance. And then to this class that Lynn was talking about, one day I was 33 years old, and I had to take a class for a continuing education class for an appraisal license that I once held. So you can imagine how exciting that is. You're in this. It was that. Remember that in Denver, that Castle Hotel? I think it's a Ramada, or it used to be a Ramada. Just a dingy room for 8 hours, an 8-hour class. And so, I was really going out of my mind. And so there were about 2 hours left in this class, and I just decided to pose myself a riddle. And I was going to write this riddle down, and I was going to spend the last 2 hours trying to figure out the answer to this made up riddle. And so I wrote on a piece of paper, I wrote, if three people are murdered at the exact same time, in the exact same fashion, in different parts of the world, what's the connection? Now, why that sentence came into my head, I have no idea. I had a perfectly normal childhood as far as I remember, but that's what came up. So I spent 2 hours trying to figure out, okay, what's the story that explains this? And I couldn't figure it out. And so I went home, and it really gnawed at me. So I started, over the next several days, I started just kind of writing about it. Sentences became paragraphs, paragraphs became chapters. I didn't even know what a chapter really was, but I'm like, okay, if I just start and number it, that's a chapter, because that's what I've seen. And it kind of became a little obsessed with this. I didn't even tell my wife at the time. Note I said at the time. That didn't become a problem at all. But 90 days later, I had a 400-page manuscript. And I knew two things. I knew two things for sure. One, that it wasn't good at all. But two, I knew that I should pay attention to this, that this was a moment in my life, an experience I'd never had before. This kind of, I don't know if you want to call it awakening or whatever it is, but I wanted to look at that with curiosity and say, maybe this is something I should be pursuing. And as much as I knew about the business world, I didn't know anything about the publishing industry. So I Googled about the publishing industry, and I said, what do I do with a 400-page manuscript? And Google said, well, you go find an agent. So then I had to figure out how I did that. And getting an agent is art and science for sure. And you have to write a query letter, and it's a paragraph about you and a paragraph about your book, and you send it out and just never hear back is typically what happens. And this was back in snail mail days. But I kind of set a goal for myself at that point in my life. Just said, okay, I just want to get an agent. I just want to get an agent, somebody in the outside world who doesn't make a dime until you make a dime, who's willing to take a chance on me. That would be enough validation to say, like, okay, this was a cool experience that I had. And after about a year and about 75 rejections, I did get an agent with that first book. And it's the agent's job then to shop it out to the publishers they know who are looking for the kind of thing that you're writing. And apparently I was writing thrillers. I didn't know. My agent says, you're a thriller writer. I'm like, okay. And so she sent it to all these publishing houses that were looking for thrillers. And then that's when I learned that it takes also about a year to get totally rejected by all the publishers. And about 6 months into that process, I started to panic because I thought, if I get totally rejected, I don't have anything else. So my agent's just going to drop me. And that's the end of this story. And by that time, I had kind of set my next goal. It was like, just get one book published. Get one book that you can get in the bookstore, that you can show to your kids, then you can die happy. And so about 6 months into getting rejected on my first book, I furiously wrote a second book. So by the time it was fully rejected, I had something new for my agent. And then book number 2 took about a year to get rejected. And about halfway through that, I wrote book number 3. Now, book number 3 took about a year to get fully rejected. And so I started getting pretty good rhythm here. But I was also learning because I didn't know anything about writing. So I was really just producing words and seeing what was good and what wasn't good. And then I started to realize, like, if you have a decent agent, they're sending it to kind of high-level editors. These high-level editors are actually reading your crappy book and writing 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs to you about why they didn't like it. And that's a gold mine of information. And so I started going through all my rejection letters and just really learning and look at the commonalities and seeing what people are saying. And so I used a lot of that to write my 4th book, which actually sold. It was my first book that sold. And it takes about another year for it to come out. So my first book, which sold to an extremely small publishing house, came out just about 9 years after that day in that class in that dingy Ramada ballroom. So I was sticking to it. And I reached my second goal 9 years later. Did not quit the day job, clearly. And that publisher went out of business about 6 months after my book came out. It's a lovely industry. And it pays a lot of money. And so then I said my next goal. My next goal was like, okay, just try to find a publisher that's a little bit bigger. You're not going to hit it big, but just try to get a little bit bigger with each book. And so we were lucky for the book that I wrote after that, which was The Boy in the Woods. We found a publisher in the UK that was a little bit bigger, and they loved the book. And that book came out, did okay, didn't do great. A lot of these smaller houses, you're not going to get tremendous sales by any means, but it made a little bit of money. And then I wrote the book after that called The Comfort of Black, and we gave it to the publisher, and the publisher's like, oh, we love this book. But your last book didn't do very well for us, so we're going to turn this down. It sucks, right? Like, it's really so we're like, okay, fair enough. So we're going to but I said to my agent, Pam, let's stick with our goal. Let's try to get a little bit bigger. So we found this mid-sized publishing house named Ocean View, and they took The Comfort of Black. And that came out. And that was like, now we're about 12 years after that class. And that was the first book where I got a few starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and from Library Journal. And that, that was really the first time listening to Pam talk today about self-doubt. It's just, you're rife with self-doubt as a writer. And that was the first time that I felt like, okay, maybe I know a little bit of a thing or two about writing because they gave me a starred review. It was really probably the first meaningful moment that I had ever had as a writer. And then that book went on to hit the USA Today bestseller list, which was great. So I wrote a book after that. I gave it to Ocean View. They published that. And then I wrote Mr. Tinder's Girl, which was an exceptionally dark story that I loved, told from the point of view, first person present tense of a 28-year-old woman. And Pam, my agent, just loved that book. I sent it to her and she called me and she's like, I'm in love with this book. So Ocean View gave us an offer on that. And I said, well, if our goal is to keep getting bigger, why don't we turn down the offer and shop this to the big 5 publishers? And that's a terrible thing to do. like you don't turn down an offer ever. And I turned down the offer. And we spent that summer getting rejected from the big 5 publishers, who all wrote lovely letters about why they didn't like the book. And then Pam found Source Books, who I had never heard of before, a publisher. It turns out they were the 10th largest publisher in the U.S. And the editor there loved the book. And that was a real learning lesson for me. It's like, you want to be with a house and with an editor that is passionate for your book and not just another title that they're producing, because they'll put a lot more energy and thought and love behind the title than they would potentially otherwise. And so I've been with Source Books ever since, and they're fantastic. And I've published 3 books with them, The Dead Husband, which is out there, and The Dead Girl. There are lots of dead things. And then The New Neighbor comes out next year. So as Lynn mentioned, I write dark psychological thrillers. Why do I write dark things? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that question. My mom asks me all the time. And it's just, I enjoy the inherent nature of conflict. And I actually, I think I see a lot more hope in my books than maybe the average reader. But I love having characters that prevail, but they really have to make it work. They really have to struggle and suffer to get to that ending of hope. And a lot of people say, that wasn't a hopeful ending at all. I'm like, well, it was to me. So it's interesting that it's been 19 years now since that day in the appraisal class. And, I really consider myself an accidental writer. I've learned a lot along the way, but I didn't know what I was doing, both writing and learning about the industry. And there's still a lot that I don't know. But I was asked to come here today, and they wanted me to talk for a half an hour. And I thought, well, the story I just told probably took 15 minutes. So now what? And I thought, well, I really started thinking about what it is I've gone through, not really having had any aspiration to be a writer or any skill set preparing me to be a writer. And I thought to myself, well, what have you learned? And what would you tell your younger self to be prepared for? And so that kind of inspired me a little bit. So I jotted down a few things about what really is it that I've learned from, not even just about writing, but kind of about life, from going through what I've gone through with this writing business, and what advice would I give my younger self? So if you'll indulge me. So one thing for sure is I've learned to embrace rejection. There's a ton of rejection in life for the average person. There's no question. But if you're a writer looking to publish a story, you can multiply that by about 1,000. But, rejection is really advice. You should really look at it as advice. You don't have to take the advice, but you should listen to it. You should be curious about it. You should let it encourage you. rather than diminish you, and have that rejection kind of help shape how you perceive yourself, and be thankful if you end up kind of acting upon it. You can still totally have dark revenge fantasies against the people who are criticizing you. Just keep them in your head. So I've definitely learned to value emotion. Writers get asked the question, what's more important, plot or character development? And I say both are equally important, but neither are interesting without emotion. I think all of us, readers and writers and human beings, we just want to feel something. So I think my character should want to feel things too. I think you should strive to write a character that when the reader's done with the book, they'll spend days thinking about afterwards and kind of miss them in a way. I think emotion is more compelling than logic, and emotion is really the cornerstone of us all beautifully flawed people here. I've learned to do a thing only if it compels you. If you can't picture yourself not doing it, don't do it. I mean, I love writing, but there are days it just totally sucks. There are days that you sit there and you're doing data entry. It's that exciting. You're just trying to get your words done. You are doubting yourself and your story and your decisions and your word choice every step of the way, and you're not sharing it with anybody until the end a lot of times. And I think you'll never survive those days if you don't love what you're doing. So, I always ask myself, why am I doing this? What's the point? And if you're a writer and the answer is for the money, stop immediately. And when you do find that thing that you love, you need to do it every day, every single day. You need to make it a routine so that routine can become a habit, and then that habit can become a lifestyle. I still have this full-time job in addition to my writing, and I get asked all the time, how does a person balance writing novels with working a full-time job? And the easy answer is you ignore your family for years on end. But I mean, truthfully, for me, the answer is this. I write 500 words a day. That's not a lot of words. And it usually takes me a half hour to 45 minutes. If I know what I'm doing, I don't outline, so I often don't know what I'm doing. But if I can do that every day, 7 days a week, I can have a book done in less than a year. And that's kind of my pace, is I write a book a year, in addition to my full-time job. And along those lines, I've learned that I love health insurance. So that's another huge reason not to quit my job. I've learned not to write what I know. Everyone says writers write what they know. I think that's kind of boring. Most of my locations are places I'm not familiar with, or places that I've made up entirely. Most of the people I'm writing about, I don't want to sound like me at all. My mom is convinced writers write what they know. And my first book, was it that one? One of my books, the protagonist, it was Revelation. The protagonist was a college kid, but his backstory was that he had been sexually assaulted as a young kid. And that really helped shape his decision-making and a lot about his character. And so my mom lives here near me, to the movies once, and she turned to me with took a deep breath, said, "I have to ask you something." And she had asked me if I was writing what I knew, and I said, "No, give me credit for my imagination." I mean, in my first book, there was a serial killer who crucified people. I'm like, I don't do that either. So I've definitely learned that I need goals. I mean, I attach goals to everything I do. I try to make them achievable goals, but not necessarily easy goals. So constantly challenge yourself, but be gracious if you don't quite make it. Just keep trying. That's very important for me. As I mentioned, I've learned I can't outline at all. I'm a pantser, as in writing from the seat of. It's actually really weird. Maybe this is how it's supposed to be, but I write now just as I wrote to answer that riddle at that appraisal class. I usually come up with what will hit me will be just an opening scene, and I don't know who who these people are or why they're doing what they're doing, but it's just a really, to me, a very interesting scene. And I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out what that scene is all about. So that's important to me, that there's not a strict guideline to go by. I mean, my stories unfold every time I sit down. There's something new. They change all the time. The unexpected comes blazing through one day. And even if I have an inkling of an idea for how an ending is going to be, it's never that. And I mean, that's life. That's what I love about it, is the unpredictability of it all. So I've learned to pay attention when weird things happen, like writing a book without having any business doing so. So I try to, when weird things happen, I try to view them with curiosity. Why is this happening? What does it mean? About 6 or 7 years ago, I was in a Starbucks, and I like to write kind of surrounded by human energy, but I like to put on my headphones and ignore everybody. And so Starbucks is great. And so I would go there and get my 500 words done. And I was writing there one day, and I felt this dude next to me, and he starts talking to me. So I kind of lifted the headphones. I'm like, okay, it's just kind of some random person who's just talking to me. And, the normal me would be polite and say, I don't want to talk to you, and go back to writing. But I really tried to be in the moment and say, well, maybe there's a reason this person is talking to me. So I became present in the moment, and I took my headphones off, and we had this really cool half-hour conversation. And he was a little eccentric about life, about everything. And it almost, to be honest, it felt a little spiritual even. And I remember, like, I had to leave, and he said, and he looked at me, really held my gaze, and he's like, kind of considered me. He's like, you're going to become big. It's like, I can tell you're going to become really big. He's like, multi-million-dollar big. He's like, it won't be till you're 50, but I can see it. And I'm almost 52. And now I'm realizing he was just some random lunatic. I've learned to use as few words as possible. I think that's important, because I think using as few words as possible gives them more weight and gives them more meaning. And I've learned how to kill my darlings, how to cut things out. Even, you might write the greatest, most precious sentence or paragraph or chapter, but if it doesn't serve your story, you have to cut it out. And I actually have "Kill Your Darlings" tattooed on my right arm, much to the chagrin of my children. I had to convince them, no, it's cool. Don't worry about it. I've also learned to give people credit to use their own imagination. And I don't describe every person, object, or setting in my book. I was doing a signing once at a Barnes & Noble in New Hampshire, and I was sitting at a little table there. And those are miserable, by the way. And this older guy kind of putters up to me, and he says, "So you're a writer, huh?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Are you a writer that describes every goddamn thing in your book?" And I said, "No, I'm not." He's like, "Good, because I hate that." And so it's, even when we were doing the cover design for Mr. Tinder's Girl, the publisher had several different designs, and they were sending them to me. And one design showed the back of a woman wearing a raincoat. And I don't know what she was wearing a raincoat. It didn't rain in the book, but she was in a raincoat, and her long blonde hair was spilling over the back of the raincoat. And I asked my editor, I'm like, "Well, why is she blonde?" I'm like, "Well, that's Alice. That's your protagonist. She's blonde." I'm like, "She might be blonde." I'm like, "I don't know. I never described it. The only description I ever gave her in my book was that she had green eyes." And I just kind of loved the fact that that was their interpretation of her. And I think it's important to give readers credit and not to describe every little thing. Yeah, I've learned to surround myself with other people who are in the writing business. I've joined critique groups. I go to industry conferences. I started a podcast. I participate in a lot of industry events, because I think that's important. I mean, as romantic the notion is of the writer kind of going Thoreau-like and heading up to a cabin and banging out a manuscript by themselves, the truth is networking in the writing industry and the publishing community is just as important as it is in any other business. I mean, and I really believe for writers, we all teach each other. I think that's important. I've also learned that a mystery writers conference is exactly the same as a real estate conference. But rather than like a panel on like eminent domain, it's about how you can poison somebody and get away with it. With real experts talking about real poisons. I've learned that sex and violence should be both treated with respect, not to be used gratuitously, and to be admired and feared in equal portions. If your character is about to get naked and or bloody, make it meaningful and make it real. If you have a protagonist who just gets clobbered in the head with a pewter candlestick and keeps on fighting, I am throwing that book against the wall. I've learned short chapters will keep somebody reading longer, and that cliffhanger chapter endings are important, but it doesn't have to be action. It can just be a tone or a mood or a simple word choice. Action's important, but it doesn't work at all without enough subtlety woven in. I've learned not to chase trends because you will always be late to the party if you try to chase a trend. And I've learned, when people talk about, who's the audience you write for and how do you think about your market, I think about me. I write to amuse myself and hope the rest falls into place because, honestly, otherwise it's not any fun. I know a lot of people who write for a specific audience and that just doesn't necessarily appeal to me. So I've learned that I'm an author, but an author is just one role on a massive publication team. And you need everybody on that team doing what they're being paid to do to get the book to actually reach the bookshelf. So it's very important to be a team player, just as you would in any industry. You can't be precious. And I think, working well with your team is just as important, if not more so, as actually writing a good book. I've learned that I really enjoyed it when people come up to me and tell me I've given them nightmares. That is strangely a warm and fuzzy feeling that I get, especially if it's a recurring nightmare. And like with rejection, I've learned to embrace vulnerability. I mean, there is nothing as vulnerable than just handing, an 85,000 word manuscript over to somebody and seeing what they think about it. But you do it enough times and you learn to just accept the good that comes with that. And it's crazy how much better life gets when you really stop caring about what people truly think about your work and you're able to kind of take that all in stride. I've learned that killing a dog is a bad idea and will produce an untold number of trigger warnings on Goodreads reviews. In my defense, the dog was a poodle. And I've learned that killing nearly any other life form, including small children, nobody will raise an eyebrow. I recently wrote my PR team said, hey, Writer's Digest wants an essay. Do you want to write an essay? And I said, sure. And they said, well, what do you want to write? And what do they want? And I'm like, well, they had this person just write this thing about how you should never kill the dog. And I'm like, can I write a counterpoint to that? Because I was kind of getting mad at all these trigger warnings about this dog that I killed. First of all, this dog was off screen. Nobody knew who this dog was. It's just like the fact that a dog had been killed was a conversation. And people are like, I'm not reading that book. I'm never reading that author. Thanks for the trigger warning. So I wrote this counterpoint, which I don't think was very well received. I'm not going to tell you. So you'll have to read all of them to find out. I mean, seriously, nobody cared about the dog. The business of writing, as you might have gleaned from me here, is brutal on so many levels. But I've really learned to take the ups and downs in stride. I don't get too excited about the TV series option because, yeah, it's great. They optioned it, but yeah, chances are it'll never happen. But I also take in stride the bad reviews or the sluggish sales, because there are a lot of those as well. My a few years ago, my publisher flew me down to Houston to do a signing and a speaking event at an indie bookstore, and they had promoted it for weeks between the publisher and me and the bookstore. And I showed up there, and man, they did a really nice job. It was in Houston, and they had 30 chairs set out and all my books in a stack, and I was signing copies, and literally no one came. Not one, not even a person who just randomly came off the street to use the bathroom. Like nobody. And so I sat there and just kind of chatted with the owner for a while. And then I'm like, I'm going to go get a steak dinner. And at dinner, I'm like, all right, I've got that story now. Hopefully I got it out of the way. I think most of all, kind of to wrap things up here, I've learned that every story has obviously 1,000 possible directions it can go, 1,000,000 possible endings. And I just kind of choose the path that feels right to me, the one that just organically comes to me. Is it always the best possible direction? No. I'm sure my stories could be much better, but they're my stories. And I think that's what's important. And when my story is done, it's done. During the story writing, I am constantly asking myself, what if? What if I went in this direction? What if this happened to this killer? What if this character just died all of a sudden? I'm constantly challenging myself to see possible interesting ways that could go. But once the story's done, I don't ask what if at all. I don't second guess. I don't ruminate. I just move on to the next book and let that book just kind of go into the wild and see what happens. So more than anything else, writing has taught me over these last 19 years the importance of 2 short and simple words, and that's let go. And that I'm actually having tattooed on my other arm in January. Thank you very much. And I think we have some time. 10 minutes for questions. No animal-related questions. Please. Yes.
That you don't go back and revise books, but the first few books that you did write, did you go back and revise them?
Yeah, that's a great question, asking if I went back and ever kind of tried to rework out those first 3 books. First of all, they're very hard to go back and even look at. I don't even like to go back and read things that I've written recently. 2 of those books, no. One of those books was very close to selling initially. And so I went back and I completely rewrote it. And my agent has it. And it's just, she's like, I'm just not sure if it's a Carter Wilson kind of a book. It gets very, as she terms, literary, like God forbid I should be literary. God forbid there's not a massacre at the end of it. But so we haven't really shopped that one yet. But the other ones, I'm a firm believer in practice novels. I think, that they really taught me a lot. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
I have not yet read any of your books, but see, you're very funny. And do you work any humor into thrillers?
Very little. My books are pretty dark. I go in a place in my head that I think becomes, for whatever reason, much darker and much more emotional when I write. And so and recognizing that there needs to be some air to breathe throughout the book, there can be some levity, but it's usually not, slapping the knee kind of, because I think that would be distracting almost. Now, I do write a monthly newsletter that's almost all, just self-effacing vulnerability, funny stuff, talking about my kids and stuff. So that's maybe my outlet for that a little bit more, but not so much in my novels. Anyone else? Yes.
I haven't read any of your books either, but
There's a trend here. This is why nobody showed up in Houston.
but I'm ready. But so when we were talking here at the table, killing scenes? Are they forensically accurate?
So that's a great question. Why do I hate research? And are my killings realistic? So I don't actually write a whole lot of violence, to be honest with you. But I truly believe anything violent has to be meaningful, and it has to be purposeful, and it has to be real. There's a great book written by Frank Ahern about violence and how you make violence realistic, because he worked in a prison system for 30 years. And how does the body actually react to, a blow and that kind of a thing? So yes, when I need to, I generally don't do research because it's just work, and I've got a lot of work going on. So it's like, I don't want. Some writers love research and they love to dive into that, and that's just not me. I write typically more about ordinary people and extraordinary situations. So if my character sees somebody holding a gun at them, they're not going to identify the make and model of that gun. They're going to be like, holy shit, there's a gun in my face. But when it comes time to, okay, I am writing in this case a small subplot about a detective, I am talking to detectives, or I am making sure that I want, you're never going to get everybody to buy in, but if you can get 70% of people to buy in, I think you're doing an okay job. So I definitely don't, avoid research. I just don't particularly love doing it. Anyone else? Yes.
Was there any possible relationship between your presentation when you were 39 and the 3 people that you thought of as far as around the world being killed?
Like, did I ever write that book?
I mean, did you ever think that was there a relationship between the people putting it on and making you think about 3 people being killed?
All I know is I ended up writing that book and it made no sense. And how I got an agent from that first book, I will never, ever know. And it's the same agent I'm still with today. All right, yes.
I used to have a funny story. So, Bob, that's my husband. He's reading your book and he loves it. And
Good.
so he's reading it. And I'll be reading it next. We got a couple more, but we got one. But so the other day I get a notification from Amazon and it said, your dead husband has arrived.
I didn't know you could order that off of Amazon. That's fantastic. Is that it, or is there one more? Or? All right, last question, maybe.
A generic question, but do they automatically do audiobooks? I mean, do you have audiobooks of your books too?
Yeah, so how it typically works is they sell subsidiary rights for your book. So like a different audiobook company, separate than your publisher, will purchase the rights to do the audio version. So yeah, all my books are on tape as well, or digital. Oh no, they don't want anything to do with me. I don't even hear them. I'll get copies. They send me like copies and like 7 CDs. I'm like, I don't have a CD player. So I don't even really listen to. I'll listen to the free little snippet on Amazon typically, and I'm like, that's not what they're supposed to sound like. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, everybody.